Hi and welcome back in this series of orchestral mockup tricks. Today we'll focus on the last core orchestral family, percussion. And honestly, for a long time I treated percussion as something I should add at the very end of my composition. Some hits here, some loops there, nothing special. But once I started orchestrating percussion properly, my composition became more cinematic, dynamic and way more convincing. In this video I want to share 5 percussion tricks which transformed my orchestral mockups, and hopefully they will do the same for you. The first big mindset shift for me was realizing that percussion also needs orchestration. It shouldn't be treated as a last-minute add-on just to fill space or make things sound bigger. Yes, percussion is often simpler to orchestrate than the pitch instruments because they are fewer harmonic dependencies. But at the same time, percussion must blend properly with pitch instruments like strings, woodwinds and brass, especially in terms of rhythm, frequency range and stereo placement. Starting from the very bottom, when I build the percussion layer, I almost always start with the lowest elements. This helps me establish the fundamental rhythmic foundation and define the core pulse of the cue. Next, I like to move to the highest percussion elements, usually things like shakers, tambourines or light metallic textures. The goal here is to immediately define both extremes of the frequency spectrum, the lowest and the highest point of my rhythmic pattern. In my template, shakers are usually placed slightly to the left side of the stereo field. They are stereo, but biased to the left. To balance the top end, I like to add a subtle counterweight on the right side. In this example is a very gentle cowbell at a low volume, just enough to balance the image without dominating the mix, especially because of its naturally piercing character. The next step is crucial, turning a repetitive, sometimes boring percussion pattern into something more organic and unpredictable. Because we should remember that if the rhythmic layer stays exactly the same throughout the entire piece, the listener will subconsciously lose interest, even if you add sophisticated harmony or melody. Rhythm needs evolution too. That's why in this example I added a snare and the glockenspiel, where the glockenspiel partially mirrors the arpeggio played by the staccato flutes. This creates rhythmic variation, reinforces musical material and keeps the listener engaged. emphasize musical accents or shaping phrases, you don't always need to add more pitch instruments. In orchestration, whether percussion or pitch instruments, I always keep one principle in mind: less is usually more. To enhance phrase accents and build momentum, I often rely on percussion elements like short taiko rolls on timpani rolls, and these are incredibly effective for supporting crescendos and making transitions feel more powerful without cluttering the harmony. For adding brightness and color, especially to woodwind runs, percussion can be a perfect companion. Instruments like Mark III, arp and triangles add spark and motion without competing with the melodic content. As I mentioned earlier, to reinforce the flute staccatos and arpeggios, part of that material is played subtly and mimicked by the glockenspiel, creating cohesive and elegant texture. One common misconception I often see is that percussion equals drums, but the percussion family is much broader than that. Instruments like celesta, glockenspiel are also percussion, and they can dramatically brighten composition, balance the frequency spectrum, and add musical clarity. This is especially important because a traditional percussion tends to dominate the lower frequency range. Without melodic or metallic percussion, the mix can easily feel bottom-heavy or unbalanced. Let's listen to the mockup, first without pitched and metallic percussion, and after that the same fragment with celesta, glockenspiel and metal added. You will immediately hear how much difference this makes, not only in the stereo balance, but also in the frequency balance and overall musical clarity. These instruments are often overlooked, but they completely transform your orchestral mockup. When it comes to panning, the first thing to understand is this. The default position of an instrument doesn't always need to be changed. Panning should never be about forcing instrument left or right just because we can or we should to. As I mentioned earlier, when talking about orchestration, the key is always maintaining a proper balance between left and right side of our stereo image. Starting with the lowest percussion, so monster hits, slow drums and similar elements, I often like to slightly close them in from the both sides. This creates a space for other instruments and keeps the low end really focused. Especially these low drums, when combined with heavier reverb, tend to push very wide in the mix. That's why gentle narrowing their stereo position is so important. It helps maintain clarity and prevent the low end from overwhelming the entire image of our composition and our mix. Finally, we got the elements which I mentioned earlier, so shakers and cowbells. To maintain balance in the high frequency, the shaker sits on the left side of the stereo field and the cowbell sits on the right side. And again, it's not about extremes, it's about keeping the stereo image stable, intentional and musical. The last trick is all about compression and overall processing of the drums, and this is where everything really starts to glue together. Let's start with the EQ. There is not much to mention, but let's dive into it deeply. Starting with the shakers, when we open the EQ, as you can see, I'm testing now my own VST plugin, which I want to release soon, so stay tuned. We have the high pass filter, something around 200 Hz and nothing more. The same story is for the cowbells, and bearing in mind that the cowbells has more low frequencies than the shakers, the high pass filters is set something around 100 Hz. And finally, low percussion. We have, as previously, high pass filter, bearing in mind that the low percussion is mainly built with the low frequencies. The high pass filter is set around 20 Hz, and additionally we have the cut around 300, and this is for the frequencies which make our sound like in the box. So we cut with this point the boxiness of the sound of the low percussion. And finally a little bit of the boost around 4K Hertz to boost the initial attack of the percussion. Moving forward to the group tracks, I usually group my percussion into two main buses, percussion high and percussion low. The processing on both buses is almost identical, with one important difference. On the high percussion bus, I like to add the tape saturation. High frequency percussion like shakers, metals, light transients benefits a lot from the subtle saturation. It adds a density, a smooth harsh transient, and helps these elements sit better in the mix. On the other hand, I avoid adding saturation on the low percussion, because low drums like taikos, monster hits rely on clarity punch and stable low ends. So saturation down there can easily blur transients and reduce the definition, especially once compression and reverb are involved. The main element that really creates glue in my percussion is parallel compression, using the settings you can see here. If you want, you can take a screenshot and take it to your project. In simple terms, to explain what is the parallel compression, is the situation when we have two signals. We blend the heavily compressed signal with the original uncompressed one. This allows me to increase perceived loudness, density and sustain without destroying the initial dynamics of the percussion. The dry signal keeps the natural transients and punch, while the compressed signal fills in the body and the tail. The result is percussion that feels powerful, controlled and consistent, but still alive. And after that, these two buses, so high percussion and low percussion, sometimes I divide it also for the metals and the mid percussion, but usually I have two buses, are routed to the main percussion bus. And what is important in this bus? This is where I apply a gentle bass compression using the Shadow Hills Master. compression, as you can see here. This final stage doesn't aim to make things louder or too aggressive. Instead, it slightly tightens the dynamics, adds cohesion between low end and the high percussion, and makes the entire section feel like one unified ensemble rather than separate elements stacked simply together. Sometimes I also like to add the multi-band compressor at the very end, so this final bass for the percussion, to have more control to each of the ranges of the frequencies, so low, middle and the high. But as far as I remember, for this mockup I disabled the plugin because I feel that the parallel compression implemented in the high percussion and low percussion bass was more than enough. Even though if you want, you can add multi-band compressor if you feel that these previous stages didn't give you the effect which you intend to receive. So that's how I approach percussion in my mockups, not as an add-on, but fully orchestrated layer. As always, project files together with the MIDI files will be available on my Buy Me a Coffee profile, so if you want to explore everything in detail, you can find the link here. Let me know in the comments which percussion instrument you struggle with the most in your mockups, and also if you find the video helpful, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this in the future. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy composing!